Okay, so on behalf of Flagler Cares and One Voice for Volusia, welcome to the 2021 Health and Human Services Summit. My name is Dale Schuberg, and I will be the moderator of this session. You have joined the session titled QPR. All participants will be muted during the session. You may submit questions during the training in the chat box, and we will pose them to the trainer throughout the session and at the end of the session if time allows. Thank you to the sponsors who made this event possible: Advent Health, Career Source Flagler Volusia, SMA Healthcare, Magellan Complete Care, Department of Children and Families, and the House Next Door. It is my pleasure to introduce to you your trainer for this session, Shawn Proctor.
Hello, thank you, Dale. I appreciate it. And you want me to go ahead and get started, even though you think more people will join?
Yeah, they probably will, but yeah, you can go ahead and start. And I'll admit them as they come in.
Okay, great. Well, everybody, my name's Shawn Proctor. I am a trainer with SMA Healthcare, which is in Flagler County, also in Volusia, Putnam, and St. Johns County. And part of my job, actually my entire job, is to go out and do community training about mental health. So I'm excited to be here. And I also teach mental health first aid in addition to QPR. And I really love doing it. I've been working in mental health for about 20 years. And let's go ahead and get started. And at the end, I will also, by the way, give you contact information to contact me if you have any questions that we don't get to answer during this session. Also want to point out that, suicide's such a huge topic, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's one of the biggest mental health crises that we can get in. And I don't have every single answer, but if you end up sending me questions, if I can find answers or point you in the right direction, I will. All right, great. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to show you a brief video about QPR.
Research shows that the odds of surviving a heart attack in a public place are 10 times greater in regions where thousands of ordinary citizens are trained in CPR. It's called bystander rescue. When someone shows signs of experiencing cardiac arrest, the response of nearby
I hope that doesn't last.
Friends, family, or coworkers is critical. The effective use of CPR doubles or triples one's chances of surviving a heart attack. Like CPR, QPR is an emergency intervention for someone experiencing a life-threatening crisis. QPR is easy to learn and easy to remember, but it takes courage to overcome our fears about reaching out to help someone who may be considering suicide. Research also shows that where QPR is widely taught, suicide attempts and deaths decrease. Just like CPR, QPR requires quick, bold, and informed action. Because suicide, like heart attacks, remains a rare event, we must train hundreds to save one, thousands to save hundreds, and millions to save thousands. There is an old Welsh saying, "No great misery goes unspoken." When we have a toothache, we tell people. We don't hide our pain. But because of the stigma and taboo around the word suicide, many people considering suicide don't speak plainly about their suffering. They fear our rejection. They fear that if they say something, we will ridicule them or make fun of them. As a result, people thinking about suicide often use indirect language. They hint at what they're thinking of doing. They send us coded messages, and they suffer in silence. Called suicide warning signs, QPR training teaches you how to recognize these warning signs, quickly decode them, and then question the person in an informed and compassionate manner to learn if they are considering suicide. Just as talking about physical pain helps diminish it, talking about suicide with someone willing and able to listen reduces psychological pain almost immediately. Trained QPR gatekeepers are merchants of hope, and hope helps prevent suicide. Millions of people have now been trained in QPR. Rigorous independent research studies support QPR as effective, and thousands of personal stories assure us that QPR is saving lives. When you use QPR, not everyone will be suicidal. Some people are simply stressed to the breaking point, but they still need help you can give. Please note that you cannot put the idea of suicide into someone's mind. People are either thinking about suicide or they're not. The fear of putting the idea of suicide into someone's head is a myth that keeps us from acting when we should do just the opposite. QPR is a universal intervention for people in pain, whether they're thinking about suicide or not. While it takes a special courage to overcome our fears, we will teach you how to ask about suicide and to offer hope through listening. Listening is the power tool that restores hope in the hopeless. We know you can do this, and we will show you how. Preventing suicide. It's what people do.
Okay. So now I'm going to share my screen again here. As that video said, with QPR, we're hoping that acronym reminds you of CPR. And CPR is so well known. CPR has become a training that we want everybody in the community to have. We want everybody in the United States to be trained in CPR, right? And we really truly feel that QPR is the same. And this is also first aid. This is also a life-saving first aid, just like CPR. And QPR stands for question, persuade, and refer. And we want to make sure that we're able to do these steps with someone who seems to be in a suicidal crisis. And a lot of it falls around this question, the Q. That's where the hang-up is. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, but much of the reticence to talk about suicide comes from a taboo that we really have in our cultures, which is just to not talk about suicide. But studies show that talking about suicide works. It works. It works in alleviating pain and in giving people hope. QPR, by doing this class, this is not intended to be any kind of counseling or treatment. It's just meant to show you how to provide some hope to somebody by being there for them, by asking questions, and by trying to refer them to somebody who can help. So the big point of this class is we're trying to instill hope in somebody. And we'll go through a couple of myths and facts before we even start with anything, because there are so many myths that float around suicide. Some of them were said in that video, but we're going to say them again. Yeah. A big myth: no one can stop a suicide. It's inevitable. That is definitely a myth. Suicide is one of the most preventable forms of death. We can stop a suicide. And the fact of the matter is that most people, when they get into a suicidal crisis, they're having suicidal thoughts. If you can help them get through that, they may never be suicidal in their life again. So we just have to help people get through this crisis period. Another myth: confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. It's definitely not true. And overwhelmingly, research shows that when people who are suicidal are asked if they're feeling suicidal, it lowers their anxiety level. It allows them to open up and talk about what's going on. And it lowers the risk of an impulsive suicide attempt. Now, what's true, though, I would say, is that often our anxiety level is very high in asking someone if they're feeling suicidal because of the taboo that floats around about this subject. It's just true. So it's very hard for us to ask this question, especially if it's someone we know and love and care about. So, but in reality, it does help. And the other myth that's kind of related to this is that you can put the idea of suicide in someone's head because you're talking about it. And it does not work that way. We do not put the thought of suicide in their head. Our minds go there automatically. And in fact, if it's crossed your mind that this person might be suicidal, then believe me, it's already crossed theirs. So you do not have to worry about putting the idea in someone's head. Only experts can prevent suicide. Some of us here in this room are really experts. Some of us in this room are probably licensed counselors and things like that. And that's fantastic. but also all of us can prevent suicide. A friend, a family member, a neighbor, and professionals. Everybody can prevent suicide. And it's really all of our business to get involved and try and help. Myth: suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. And I've heard professionals say this before, even, I've heard people say, hey, they're not serious. If they were really serious, they would never tell you that they're suicidal. They're just doing it for attention. That's not true. People will share their plans. And oftentimes it depends on how much rapport you have with a person, how much they trust you. But it's also true that people communicate their suicidality, sometimes not even on purpose. Sometimes it's through behavioral changes. And we'll talk about some of those things that might show up as warning signs. Those who talk about suicide don't do it. So that's kind of related to that. It's just not true. People who do talk about suicide very often do attempt suicide. So once a person decides to attempt suicide, there's nothing anyone can do about it. That's another myth. And we'll talk more later about suicide being a choice that people make, and you can help them find other choices, and you can prevent this type of death. And in reality, almost anything you're doing, just by talking about the subject and acting in their life, is providing some hope. So any positive action might save someone's life. And the biggest way you can help is ask the suicide question. But before we get to the suicide question, we're going to have to hash out some things, because we want to make sure that we're asking the right people if they're suicidal. It never harms to ask someone if they're suicidal, of course, but we don't ask everybody we meet if they're feeling suicidal. Often we're going to ask them this question because we see warning signs, we see clues. And actually, I like that they have this training. It says suicide clues. I like that word, because there are no universally agreed upon warning signs that, hey, if someone does this, then they're definitely going to attempt suicide. It's more about clues. We see changes in their behavior. We hear things they say. We know about events in their life that we know put them at a great risk for suicide. So then we decide we need to ask the question. But take all signs and all clues seriously. And one of the first ways, of course, that people can hint that they're suicidal is through verbal clues. Sometimes these verbal clues are intentional, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're very direct, and sometimes they're very indirect. Here are some examples of direct verbal clues. I've decided to kill myself. If someone says that's obviously a warning sign, right? I wish I were dead. It's very plain that they don't want to be living anymore. So they could be making that choice to be dead. I'm going to commit suicide. People might just say that out loud. By the way, I do like to make a point that in mental health advocacy, we try to avoid the word commit suicide. We say that someone died by suicide, or that they completed suicide, or attempted suicide. And we don't want to say the word commit because there are a lot of negative connotations to the word commit. Like the kind of things people commit are murder and crimes and sins. If you're part of a religious community, people commit sins. We want to get rid of that negative connotation. But that person might use the language commit suicide. You're definitely still going to hear that language out there. I'm going to end it all. Clearly saying they're going to end it all. If such and such doesn't happen, I'll kill myself. So sometimes people put conditions on it, if this doesn't happen, then I'll kill myself. Or if this does happen to me, I'll kill myself. For example, if I lose my job, I'll kill myself, or something like that. But people might also be less direct. They might have more indirect verbal clues. I'm tired of life. I just can't go on. That's obviously a statement of exhaustion and sounding like depression, right? And, that's a statement that you would need to dig a little deeper into. My family would be better off without me. And, sometimes when I'm out doing suicide training or mental health training and I'm talking about suicide, I will sometimes have people ask me, how can a young mother or a father kill themselves and leave their family behind, leave their kids behind, and not provide for them? But the answer to that question is you have to look at it from the person's perspective. in the state that the person is feeling right now, they feel like the choice for them to leave their family by dying would be better for the children, because they feel like they're not doing the best that they can for the family. So you have to recognize their point of view of what's going on. Who cares if I'm dead anyway? Nobody's going to notice if I'm gone. I just want out. What is it that you want out of? That's something that begs, for you to ask more questions. These next two, I won't be around much longer, and pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. These are two statements that I sometimes think about that. You might hear that from the elderly, from someone who's elderly, or maybe has a chronic illness or something like that. And those can be pretty dangerous statements. And people who are elderly, people about 65 years old and over, although 65 isn't really that old anymore. I know 65-year-olds that are running marathons and can run circles around me, but around 65 and over, your suicide rate greatly increases. That is one of the dangerous age groups, is elderly. The other dangerous age group is young people. And for people between the ages of 10 and 34, suicide is currently the second leading cause of death, or at least it was last time I checked. Every now and then new statistics come out. It may have gotten itself back down to the third, because I heard in 2019 rates went down a little bit. That might have changed some, but it's either the second or third leading cause of death for people between the age of 10 and 34. So generally you have young people and older people who are at the greatest risk. And I can just see someone that's elderly saying things like that. I won't be around much longer. You won't have to worry about me for much longer. So behavioral clues, these are the things that we can often pick up that sometimes the person doesn't even know they're doing, right? But we see these changes in their behavior. One of the things I'm always pointing out about mental health is when you're worried about someone's mental health, notice all the changes in their life, all the things that might happen. They start doing certain things more, they start doing certain things less. And you question why that is. Also, some things in their history, but this isn't exactly a current behavioral clue that they might be doing, but if you know someone has previously attempted suicide, then you know that they are already at an increased risk for attempting suicide again. Unfortunately, statistically, that's just true. It increases your risk of attempting suicide later on in your life if you have one suicide attempt. Doesn't mean you will, but it does increase that risk some. Acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills. So the person might be looking for means. I usually share with my classes that I'm doing that I have recurrent major depressive disorder. It's something I've learned how to live with. I take medicine for it. I have coping strategies. I know when I'm going downhill and that I need some help. Now, if knowing that I have a recurrent form of major depressive disorder and that I've struggled with depression for years and years and years, if I were to go buy a gun, because I don't really own a gun, I'm not interested in guns. I don't like them. Just because I didn't grow up with them, I don't have a problem with them. But if I were to go buy a gun, I hope my wife would say, "Why do you want a gun now?" Right? Where did that come from? Because she knows that I have a history of depression. Right? So these are the kind of things you have to think about. Maybe I just started hanging out with people that shoot and I want to go shooting with them. But that would be a good question from my wife is, why on earth do you want to buy a gun now? Stockpiling pills. You might have to watch. Sometimes teenagers will go to grandma and grandpa's house and start plucking pills out of the medicine cabinet, right? So when you see someone acquiring these means, when you have quick access to means of suicide, then you might, in a more impulsive way, lead to an attempt. Co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness. Depression is obviously the biggest diagnosis we usually link to suicidal thoughts. That hopelessness word really bothers me. And in mental health charts, when you're working in a mental health unit or something on a hospital, or often we see that word a lot in people's charts. But whenever I see that word, that someone feels helpless or hopeless, I start to worry. Because if you are hopeless, then you may make the choice to attempt suicide because you may feel it's the only hope you have to be out of the pain that you're in. That's why we want to instill hope. Putting personal affairs in order. So sometimes people might pay off debts, or they might tell people goodbye that they haven't talked to in a long time. Finalize a will. Giving away prized possessions is one of those classic suicide warning signs that we hear about a lot. Giving away your favorite things, right? Sudden interest or disinterest in religion. This is another one of those changes that could go either direction. So they might become very interested in religion because they're thinking about what happens to them after they die, for example. Or they might become very disinterested in religious if they were previously religious or part of a faith community of some kind in which they were really active, and then all of a sudden they become very disinterested. That could be a sign that they feel that God has given up on them, or that they feel that their faith community has given up on them, and that could be a warning sign. So either way that could go. Drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after a period of recovery. About 25% of people that die by suicide have a substance use disorder. And about 50% of people that attempt suicide are intoxicated when they do it. They're under the influence when they attempt. So this is a huge factor, is sobriety. Drug and alcohol abuse raises the impulsivity that might lead to someone attempting suicide. It lowers the inhibitions that allows them to attempt when maybe they weren't able to unless they got intoxicated. So unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability, and that can be just a part of depression. I mean, that depression, often these things go along with it. You're angry, you're irritable, but we want to watch this. When this gets really out of control, if someone's really angry, really irritable, when you want to dig in, find out what's going on in their life, right? Situational clues. And these situational clues are things that are triggers. They're kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So these triggers that might happen right before a suicide attempt, that might put someone in a suicidal crisis. Being fired or being expelled from school is one of those. So your current plans, your current trajectory in life has now been dissolved, right? So that sense of purpose may be gone. Especially young people may have no idea what to do after that point. The being expelled from school I find interesting because when I do think about young people, especially if you work with adolescents, if you've ever noticed, or you have a lot of adolescents in your life, right? And all of us were an adolescent at some point. And I know that when I was an adolescent, and this is how a lot of teens feel, they can't see life after graduation from high school or life after college graduation. And they don't know what it's going to be like after that. They have an interesting sense of time. So when they've been expelled from school, now they really truly might not know what's next. And that uncertainty can be really terrifying. A recent unwanted move. Anytime we move, we lose our social support system that we previously had. It changes. And sometimes it takes a long time to build a new one. Loss of any major relationship. And so whether it's a best friend, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a long-term relationship with someone, this is another one where young people often, the first person they ever fell in love with, and then they break up. And young people aren't able to see that that's just the first person you ever fell in love with. There are going to be more. But this could be true at any point in life. I think for young people, it's specifically kind of poignant. It sticks out. The death of a spouse, a child, or best friend. So when you lose someone that's very close to you, and especially if that's by suicide, there's generational suicide sometimes where somebody dies by suicide and their dad had died by suicide and their grandfather had died by suicide, and it just kind of comes down the line. You also have things like suicide contagion, which might happen in a high school. If one student dies by suicide, you get a rash of attempts within the school. It's another example. Oh, also celebrities. If a celebrity dies by suicide, and maybe their fans might feel tempted to attempt suicide too. Okay. Diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness, especially when it's associated with pain, is obviously a big stressor in someone's life and could lead to suicide attempt. Sudden unexpected loss of freedom or fear of punishment. So you might have someone who's facing charges, for example. Something like that. An anticipated loss of financial security. So this is a big one. When people lose their income, when people lose their job, when people lose their housing, those losses are very traumatic. Loss of a cherished therapist, counselor, or teacher. So if you lose somebody that you're very close to, that you see as wise, somebody that you idolize, perhaps a role model, very dangerous time. Fear of becoming a burden to others. I think this is another one that's a good example for elderly or people who, again, were diagnosed with a serious illness. That is a fear that people have, especially here in America. Here in America, we are very concerned about this because independence is such an important value for us as a culture. So actually, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to flip the page. I don't know, Dale, if you can help with this maybe, is what I'd like to do is flip the page and read a scenario. And the scenario is going to have things in it. And I would like for you guys to maybe type in the chat box, those of you that are able, and point out some of the things that might be warning signs, things that are clues that this person may be at risk for suicide. Will that work for you, Dale? Wonderful, thank you. So you are a 22-year-old single male who has just been arrested for driving under the influence. You are referred to a court-ordered alcohol assessment and to the college counseling center. On an athletic scholarship, you're recently separated from your girlfriend, who you saw on a date with another member of your team last week. You've been drinking since age 16, but your drinking has increased since your girlfriend left you, to the point that now you've been stopped by the police. You're angry about being sent in for an assessment and anxious about what will happen with your scholarship and perhaps your driver's license. In addition to being angry about getting stopped by the police, you're also ashamed because you have been very successful as a student athlete, and many students look up to you. You feel that everything is coming down on you all at once and feel hopeless about your future and don't think you can handle it without drinking. The day before your scheduled appointment at the counseling center, you are talking with your resident hall advisor about being forced to keep the appointment. You say, maybe I'll just skip the appointment. Sometimes I think everyone would be better off if I wasn't around. All right. So does anybody, if you notice something, a clue, please put it in the chat box. Yeah, I don't know, Dale, if you could call them off too.
Sarah M said indirect verbal cue.
Yep, verbal clue for sure. And yeah, that would probably be indirect, but it's definitely a concerning one that you want to dig into. Yep, great. What else?
And Denise says he believes he will be better off dead.
Yeah. So again, the direct clue, the indirect verbal clue. Yeah. What else do we see here that's a clue?
That's it so far. Oh, here we go. Feeling people can no longer look up to him, loss of success.
Yeah. And you see that there's a word in there, ashamed. He feels shame from what's happened. He's kind of lost his social status. Yeah. Anything else?
Yep. Feeling hopeless, alcohol abuse.
All right. Hopelessness. You caught my my trigger word. That always bothers me when I say hope, when I see the word hopeless. The alcohol abuse is very concerning. Number one, he's been doing it since he was an adolescent, but number two, it's increasing right now. That is something to notice and to be worried about. Sure.
And also loss of relationship.
Loss of relationship. Hey, and not just that. Hey, now you're seeing the girlfriend hang out with people who are supposed to be friends of yours. Now she's dating a teammate. Anything else?
That's it so far. Oh, here we go. Loss of status. He has fallen from grace.
Yep. That's where that shame part can come in for him, right? He's definitely lost status. There's some other things I would point out here too. One of them is his age. If you remember, we mentioned earlier that for younger people, they are at an increased risk for suicide. Something we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to talk about in the next slide, is that he's male. Males complete suicide at a far higher rate than females. Females do, however, attempt suicide more often. So you have a discrepancy there, which is interesting, but it's mostly due to means. Males tend to attempt suicide, or they tend to die by suicide with firearms, whereas females tend to overdose, which when you overdose, maybe someone finds you, or it doesn't work, or you change your mind right after doing it. You call 911. You say, oh my God, what did I just do to myself? And you call 911. But that's another thing. Another thing is potential loss of freedom. Remember, he might lose a scholarship. If he loses his scholarship, that might mean that he can't be in college anymore. That might mean a lot of things, and losing his driver's license. Big thing for freedom, right? Especially for young people. One more thing I'd like to point out about the scenario that I'd like you to think about is that one person may not have seen all of these warning signs. We're at a bird's eye view of this thing. We're a mile high above. We can see everything. But for instance, the resident hall advisor may not have seen everything else that was going on, right? The counselor may not have seen what was going on with the girlfriend, for example, if he didn't share it with her. So you have different layers there. Sometimes we don't get to see the whole picture. That's why it's important to dig in when you see a few warning signs. Start digging in and asking the person about it. All right. So great. Let's look at this. This chart here is a little overwhelming when you look at it. It's a bunch of circles, but I'll break it down a little bit. On the left, you have these different pathways that might lead to a suicidal crisis. And if you see the biological pathways, you have things like genetic load. And what that means is some of us are born with a genetic predisposition, a biological predisposition towards mental illness, for example, like maybe depression or anxiety disorders or bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder are 15 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population, right? So, or substance abuse as well seems to have a huge genetic component. So if you're born with those things that already have increased risk, then that's a problem. Sex, so your gender definitely plays a role, which we just talked about. Race is kind of a complicated picture. White males are traditionally at a very high risk. Black males have been increasing a lot over the last few years, apparently. And there's kind of a myth that goes along that Black people don't attempt suicide. And that's not true at all. But there is a myth that I've heard about that. And people often are trying to break that myth. And it needs to be noted that African-American suicide rates are rising. African-American women tend to have one of the lower risk. Also, Native Americans have a high risk. Native Americans have a very high risk of suicide. Age, we talked about, younger and older are kind of the age groups that we have to be a little more concerned. We have to watch a little closely. Then we have that personal psychological pathway. And a lot of that has to do with things like trauma, right? So child abuse or a loss of a parent or someone close to you. It's this culture shock shift. If you move, we said something about moving earlier. That's a really big deal, is moving. And the United States even is a very diverse place. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. And I moved to Florida, and it was a very different culture, actually. Things were different here. And let alone if you move to another country that has an even more different culture. Values and religious beliefs, things like that are important. People who have high religious involvement do have lower risk of suicide. And people that come from religious traditions that really view suicide as a sin and say you're going to go to hell if you die by suicide. They'll say commit suicide. People who come from those traditions do actually have a lower risk of suicide. That is a preventative factor. Sometimes that can play a role too, though, if you're a part of a religious community that has a lot of stigma against people with mental illnesses. So even depression can be very, very stigmatized sometimes in some religious communities, and then it makes it more difficult for people to talk about it and get help. So there's a little bit of a mixed bag there, but overall, religious participation decreases the risk of suicide. Drugs or alcohol, we've talked about that. Drug or alcohol abuse definitely increases your risk. You look at the environmental things, season of the year, certain times of the year have higher suicide rates. They just do. And so you have that, but you also have seasonal affective disorder and things like that. You have geography. Some towns just have high suicide rates, right? Urban versus rural. Yeah.
Huggins, I think they put in sexual orientation as a.
Yes. LGBTQ stat. Yeah. Thank you, Dale. And this is an older chart that I wish had that on there. Unfortunately, this chart comes from QPR, so I'm technically not allowed to change it. But if I had to change it, I would definitely add LGBTQ issues there. And LGBTQ, people who are LGBTQ, depending on what studies you look at, right, anywhere from 2 to 8 more times likely to attempt suicide. I've seen numbers kind of everywhere, but definitely increased due to the shame that might be attached, due to, especially if you're part of a religious tradition, it doesn't like, that's another place where the religious values can hinder getting help for depression or things like that. And because of bullying primarily, right? Because feeling like you're not allowed to fit in with society. So yes, whoever said that, absolutely, LGBTQ issues, being LGBTQ increases your risk for suicide. So thank you, great comment. Urban versus rural. When you live in a rural area, like parts of Flagler County, right? It's difficult to get treatment often. Often you have less access to treatment, so that becomes a real problem. Often urban areas, believe it or not, have lower suicide risk because there's more help there. Having a model for suicide, having somebody who died by suicide that you either look up to or that you knew, or somebody in your family, which you mentioned earlier. So then we have those proximal risk factors. Those are situational clues that we talked about earlier. And the crisis in relationship, the loss of freedom, being fired, expelled, illness, whatever it might be, the thing that happens that kind of sets you in the direction. So you have those pathways, then something happens. When you have those risk factors on the left, something happens, then you get to that big circle there towards the right, which says increasing hopelessness and contemplation of suicide as a solution. And this is the problem that we have to recognize, is that when we're trying to help someone who's feeling suicidal, for them, suicide is not the problem, it is the solution. They see suicide as the solution to their problem, which can then lead to the cause of death over on the right, whether it's firearms, hanging, overdose, whatever it might be. In between there, though, before we get to the cause of death, we have that, it says wall of resistance. And what that is that's our protective factors. Those are the things that are built up that keeps us from attempting suicide, right? So these protective factors fight back against the risk factors. Having a counselor or therapist and being compliant with medication and treatment, whether it's, what we would call medical medication, for physical ailments, or whether it's for mental health compliance, whatever it might be, because you want that good health, right? Having significant others that are very supportive of you, having a pet statistically makes you less likely to attempt suicide because you have responsibility for the pet. You have companionship from the pet. Treatment availability, all of these things on here. Sobriety, you see the big brick on the bottom, because sobriety is such a key for people that have issues with substance use. And you just have to stay sober. And especially if you're part of a 12-step program that says that, and you have a sponsor and you're really working through that problem, you see AA or NA sponsor up there. That's another big factor. And I'm going to skip that slide for a second, but we go over here to suicidal crisis episode. This chart just shows you that suicidal crisis generally has a time limit. Once that initial hazard is encountered, that's the proximal trigger, that's the situational clue. People start getting into crisis and that risk increases. And once you get up to that peak of that crisis, is really a matter of hours, maybe 72 hours, right? We have Baker Acts that initially start off a hold at 72 hours. We're trying to help people get through that crisis period. And if we can get them through that crisis period, the risk starts to diminish where they can stabilize again. It says down there approximately 3 weeks for the whole crisis. That again, that's a very approximate thing. It could be very different for different people. So I don't want to don't get stuck on that 3-week number, but that's what could happen, right? So our gentleman, for instance, in our scenario, the college student, he may be in this window at this point. We want to help him by giving him hope and getting him to the other end of the crisis by giving him other choices besides suicide, finding other solutions for him. So tips for asking the suicide question. We're ready to ask the suicide question. I know it's taken us a long time to get there, but we are ready to ask the question. And just a few tips about this, because this is the part that people are really nervous about, right? That this sometimes is very, very hard to do because there's a taboo attached to it. So if in doubt, don't wait, ask the question. If you're thinking, well, yeah, they have a couple little clues, but I'm not sure, just ask the question, because it is not going to hurt ever to ask the question. So don't doubt, don't worry, just ask it. And if someone's really reluctant to answer the question, then you have to be persistent. And what I would add to that really is that you have to keep trying to build rapport with the person. You have to keep trying to build your trust with that person, because this is such a hard, intimate topic to talk about. And again, because it is so intimate, you talk to them alone in a private setting, not in front of a group of people, because you really need their trust to be able to open up. And allow this person to talk, to say whatever they need, and give yourself plenty of time for the conversation. Let them open up and say whatever they need, however they need. Sometimes just this fact of getting these thoughts out is enough to give them hope. It's enough to decrease the psychological pain, the emotions. And when you give that all that time, that alone might be the thing that saves their life. Right? So you want to allow that to just come out, and you just listen completely non-judgmentally. You just listen to everything they have to say. Just be there. Have resources handy, right? Have phone numbers, counselors' names. The QPR card, by the way, when we do this class in person, there's a little booklet that I give people. It has a QPR card that has information on it. So it has the suicide hotline, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. I'll put these things up on the screen later so you can see them. Also, the crisis text line, which is 741-741, and you just text that number and you can talk to a crisis counselor through texting. Our phone number, SMA Healthcare, for example, which is 1-800-539-4228. I'll put these things up on the screen later. But those are all numbers that you can call. And how you ask the question is less important than the fact that you ask it. Right? We're going to talk about kind of the right way and wrong way to ask questions, but the most important thing is that you ask it. And you may take a real indirect approach where you build up the conversation. Have you been unhappy lately? Have you been really unhappy lately? Have you been so very unhappy lately that you're thinking about ending your life? You build up in the conversation. You build it. And maybe you even get here. Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? Sometimes people prefer to have this kind of less direct approach. And I'm actually kind of an advocate of the direct approach, but it depends on how much the person is trusting you right now, how much you have to build up in the conversation. And this says, when people are as upset as you seem to be, they sometimes wish they were dead. I'm wondering if you feel that way too. This one I don't like. It says, you look pretty miserable. I wonder if you're thinking about suicide. Don't say you look pretty miserable, because that just kind of sounds like the person's having a bad hair day, right? But what they're trying to say there, actually, I think it would have been worded better if you said, you don't look like yourself. You don't look happy. And I'm just wondering if you're thinking about suicide. And here's really direct. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And, you have to ask this with the right tone of voice, a very non-judgmental tone of voice. We do not want to put any hint of judgment in this. And another big thing is, if you cannot ask this question, let's say it's your own child, and you just can't form the words to your own child, find someone who can, right? Find somebody who can, because it's such an important issue to ask, right? Here's how you don't ask the question, though. You don't say, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Because you're leading the witness. You're telling them what answer you want to hear. When you say it that way, you're saying that you don't really want to, you want them to say no. And then they're going to say no. You wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? Remember what I said a minute ago about being non-judgmental, right? And this one too, is suicide, the dumb idea. Surely you're not thinking of suicide. If you're being judgmental with someone, they are going to shut down. They are not going to talk to you. They're not going to tell you. You have to be very kind of matter of fact. Just say things calmly, pleasantly, and pleasantly, not happy, but you say things in a serious tone of voice and a supportive tone of voice, right? That's cute. That's really it. We just need to ask the question, and those are just some tips on it. But then we get to P, persuade, and this is simpler than you think too. Listen to the problem, give them your full attention, which we already said. Take plenty of time to hear what they need to say. Suicide is not the problem. It's only the solution to a perceived insoluble problem. They have a problem and they don't know how to solve it. It might be their depression. It might be their illness. It might be their financial situation. But whatever it is, they don't know how to solve that problem. And that's what we have to view suicide as the problem. And that's the solution they find. For them, it's a logical choice to make this choice of suicide. We have to give them other options. So don't be judgmental and offer them hope in any form. We're going to talk about refer in a minute. Giving them referral sources is offering hope. To be honest, the fact that you've gotten this far and that you're showing them that you care enough to talk to them about this is giving them hope. If they're part of a religious community, trying to tie them in with clergy might be someone that can give them hope. In whatever form you have, we're giving them hope because they're feeling hopeless. Will you go with me to get help? Will you let me help you get help? Because often people at this point aren't able to get the help themselves. They may need you to help call for help. They may need you to take the lead in helping them get help. And then you try and get that verbal commitment out of them. You just get a promise. You know, we're not going to call it a contract. We're just going to call it a promise. Will you promise me not to kill yourself until we found some help? We all know what it's like to make a promise with people. And usually it's with someone that you know well, someone that you care about. And that's what you're trying to get from them. It's just a promise that they will not kill themselves till we found some hope. Your willingness to listen this far already might have already rekindled that hope, and you might have saved their life already. Just getting this far. It's all about just having the conversation. Like I just said, people often don't believe at this point that they can get help. So that's why you have to really be involved in helping them get the help sometimes. The best way you can do that is taking the person directly to someone who can help. And if you can take someone to the emergency room, if you can take someone to SMA Healthcare in Daytona Beach at our crisis stabilization unit, if you can take someone to their doctor, to their counselor, then that's the best way to refer somebody. The other thing, of course, we have is Baker Acts here in Florida. If you did have somebody that was refusing to get help, but you really think suicide is imminent, this person might attempt suicide at any time, or maybe they've given you a plan. They have a plan for suicide and the risk is very high. We can call the police and ask them to do a wellness check on the person, explain, and say that I think the person might need to be placed under a Baker Act, and then the police can try that. There are ways to have those kinds of things done, and hopefully we can get them to go voluntarily, because it's good when people are invested in their own treatment. The next best thing you can do, though, is getting a commitment from them. You get that promise that they're not going to attempt suicide, and then you help make those arrangements to get them that help. The third best referral that you can do, sorry for that example there, the best referral is getting a commitment from them to accept help and then making the arrangement to get that help. That might mean that you are maybe getting them a doctor's appointment. Maybe you think that the suicide's not going to happen imminently. They've made the promise to me they're not going to do it, but I've got them in to see their doctor or their therapist, in a few days. That's the next best thing you can have happen. Another outcome, though, that might happen is maybe you think this person would never qualify for a Baker Act. They won't go on their own to go get help. But you give them phone numbers. You make sure they have their doctor's phone number. You give them the suicide prevention hotline. You give them the crisis text line. You give them SMA's number. You get all of that information. Any willingness to accept that help at some time is a good outcome, because people do call those numbers. They do it all the time. So make sure that person has all of that information. Almost any time that we step in and try to help someone who's feeling suicidal works. Almost every time it is met with some kind of relief. So don't hesitate to just get involved, take the lead, jump into that person's life and try to help them. Tell them, I want you to live. I'm on your side. We'll get through this. Get other people involved. You got to wrap that person around. Ask who else can help. Do you have family? Do you have siblings? Do you have parents? Do you have a clergy member? Do you have a physician or a therapist or somebody like that, counselor that might be able to help? And you wrap that person up in that help. Get to know people in the community. Many of you might be professionals that already have a team surrounding you. Get to know those people. And get to know all those people that you might be able to make those referrals to. Talk to this person after QPR, right? This isn't first aid where you just walk away after it's done. You've put a bandage on it and now it's over. Follow up with them, call them, send them a card, visit them, say, hey, how are things going? Were you able to make it to that appointment? Are you feeling any better? Is there anything else I can do to help you? Show them that you care. You're really just planting the seeds of hope, and hope is the cure for suicide. Hope is the remedy. That's what we want to do, is instill that kind of hope. And that is my phone number and my personal email address. Feel free to call me, or if you want to take a screenshot of that or something, email me if you'd like to. I'd be perfectly happy to talk with you. Or if you have questions, and and if I don't know the answers, like I said at the beginning, I will certainly try to point you in the right direction. This also, if you'd like to take a screenshot of that, that's where you can go to that website, use my instructor code right there, and get some free information about QPR. You can download the booklet that I was talking about. You can download a digital copy of it. So I encourage you to write that down and take that information, go onto that website and get it. And that concludes my slideshow. And hold on a second. I'm going to see if I have one more thing on here. I do not, but I'm going to write down some numbers and show them. So I really thank everybody for being here. Dale, were there any questions in the chat that you think I need to address?
Brian said around when you were talking about giving tips for asking about the suicidal thoughts, he said that those were very useful tips. Thank you for that. And then he said, thank you as well for the presentation. Can you put that slide with the information again?
Oh, sure. And first, though, I'm going to put up a slide real quick. I'm going to put it up in a Word document because I didn't think to make the slide, because when I do it in person, I have this information. So I apologize for that. But I'm going to put the suicide prevention hotline up, which is 1-800 273 talk. And I want to put the crisis text line up, which is 741-741. And I want to put SMA's phone number. And actually, I want to share with you guys too that we have what's called the crisis response team, which is active in Volusia and Flagler counties. Those are the only counties it covers. But if you had somebody that was in crisis, and you needed somebody to maybe even come to see that person, this hotline, if you called it and asked for the crisis response team, you can talk to a crisis counselor online, but you can also, sorry, I'm talking and writing at the same time. I'm not the best at that. You can also talk to someone online, but they also have mobile capacity where they can come out and see you. And I think that's really, really important. So you see that right there. And the SMA, that's where you could ask for the crisis response team. And not just that, but the crisis response team will also connect the person with care coordination, who will continue to stay in contact with them for about 72 hours to make sure they have follow-up appointments and all of the care that they need. So if you would like to screenshot that thing right there or whatever, that would be fantastic. And then I'm going to give people a couple minutes for that. Then I'm going to put up that information again that you asked for. Was there anything else, Dale? Oh, have I been a part of the Zero Suicide Grant implementation at SMA? A little bit, because I'm helping train a lot of our people here at SMA and in QPR. I'm also part of another grant, a mental health awareness training grant, where I do primarily mental health first aid out in the community. So that's the big part of what I've done, but I do help out a little bit with Zero Suicide. The Zero Suicide trainer is right next to me. It has a spot right next to me here, and her name is Ann Harley. She's our main suicide prevention trainer. Let's see. Okay, now I'm going to, everybody probably got that. I'm going to put this slide up again real quick, the information that you were asking for. Let me find this. There we go. And I assume that's probably the information you were asking for, whoever's was asking for that. So if you'd like to take a screenshot of that or write it down real quick, that's where you can go get some information. Well, it's actually what you'll get is your QPR booklet. And if somebody absolutely, for some reason that doesn't work, you can feel free to email me. I'll put that information up again real quick and say, hey, will you mail me one of those booklets? And I'll certainly do that for you. No problem.
Yeah, she said yes, and thank you.
Okay, great. Great. So that's all I have to share. And I thank everybody for being here. And
All right, so there's no further questions, it doesn't look like. So yeah, thank you, Shawn, for the presentation. Great information. Thank you all for attending this session today. I'm now going to end the meeting. Please navigate back to our event platform through HOVA or to our virtual event program to join our lunchtime keynote session from 12 to 1 p.m. All right, thank you guys. I'm going to end this.
thank you, everybody.
All right.